All right. Welcome to whatever time zone it is, wherever you are. I want
Okay,
to
Keith,
spend.
take us away.
Okay, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what's next for the GQL standard now that we've published a version of the standard. So, I've met many of you, but not everybody. So, a quick introduction. Basically, I'm a database geek and have been doing consulting on high-performance database systems for quite a while now. Spending time focusing on high-performance database systems, data replication, and database administration. For the standards world, I got involved a while ago and have ended up as the convener of the international committee responsible for the database language standards for the SQL and GQL standards. And in the US, I'm actually the vice chair of the US committee that is parallel to the international committee. I've also been working for a number of years on a contract with the Neo4j Langstar team, specifically working on the standard. So what I want to try to talk about today in a short amount of time is what's next? The GQL standard was published in April of 2024, April 12th, if you're looking to be exact. And so the next things that we're working on are first, encouraging vendors to implement GQL and to publish GQL conformance statements, and then working on the next version of the GQL standard. And I'll give you a few highlights of the things that we're looking at there. So, as with the SQL standard, the GQL standard has a specification of what it means to claim conformance to the standard. And basically that is implement a subset of the GQL standard that includes the mandatory features, possibly some optional features, to decide and document values for implementation defined elements, and so on. The important part of this is that to claim conformance, you really need to document your conformance in a conformance statement. One of the complications of the mandatory features is that when we were building the standard, we have a nomenclature for optional features, but we don't actually have a nomenclature for the mandatory features. And so that's a little bit of a challenge when you're writing a GQL conformance statement. In the standard, subclause 24.2, minimum conformance, describes what it means to claim conformance to the standard. And one of the other complications is that there are cases where to claim conformance, you need to claim conformance to either, for example, a graph with an open graph type or a graph with a closed graph type. You don't have to do both, but you need to do at least one of those. And there's various other things, Unicode versions, some minimal data types that you need to describe, and so on. Anyhow, there's reasonably complete documentation in the standard about what it means to claim conformance to the standard. So for implementation, why take the time to write and to publish a conformance statement? Well, my claim is that the GQL standard validates the property graph database technology. We could argue about that, but I believe that's what is happening. The standard validates the technology. GQL implementations validate the GQL standard. Conformance statements validate the GQL implementations. And so there's this chain. We have a technology that is pretty cool. We need implementations to actually show that they actually adhere to the standard that describes the technology. And conformance statements are part of the documentation for the GQL implementation. This is in part, it's a tool for users. It gives users a starting point to compare GQL implementations. SQL database vendors have been writing conformance statements for decades. And one possibility would be to model a GQL conformance statement on the SQL conformance statements. A couple of examples that I've looked at relatively closely include the Postgres documentation, Appendix D, SQL conformance. The Oracle documentation is also reasonably well-structured way of describing conformance. And last spring, Neo4j published a conformance statement as part of their documentation. So if you're looking at building a conformance statement, these are good places to start. You may want to do it slightly differently, but writing a conformance statement is important. Having a conformance statement published and available to users, I think, is important. So what are we going to do next? We could say the standard is done and just sit on our laurels, but I've always found sitting on laurels to be uncomfortable because they're kind of hokey. So we're beginning to work on additions and changes to the standard. And one of the things one of the concepts that we're working with is that we want the next version of the standard to be more incremental rather than huge monolithic additions. So only small monolithic additions. First thing, bug fixes. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment, but we also have added conditional execution. We're looking at vector types. We're looking at cheapest and optimal path and schema information graph, and possibly some other things that we don't know about yet. The standards process has a mechanism for documenting bug fixes, and we have identified a number of outright bugs in the standard, and so we have a draft technical core agendum. My best guess at the moment is that we will publish a technical core agendum for GQL possibly in 2026, and the changes documented in the core agendum will be incorporated into the next version of the GQL standard. What else are we looking at? Well, in September, we accepted a proposal for conditional execution. And the idea is to be able to branch into a subquery depending on the results of some sort of evaluation. The example that I stole from the paper, GYD 030, is I have a match of something that I'm going to call n. And if n.age in months is greater than 1, or there exists n.age.month is greater than 1, then I want to match n with something called an edge called isParent and another node called person. Otherwise, I want to match n with an in hospital and something else called hospital. So the idea is to have to be able to augment my current data that I'm looking at with the outer match condition with one or another of some sort of inner match. It looks to have some potentially powerful capabilities for building GQL match statements. And it's worth a lot more time than I'm going to give it on this slide. So this has already been added for the next version of GQL. We're looking at vector types and operations on those vectors. In September, we accepted a paper for the SQL standard that added vector types and vector operations and to the SQL standard. And so what we're working on is a paper, a proposal to add those capabilities, parallel capabilities, to the GQL standards. So you have a vector construction, a set of vector distance functions, and various other things that are useful. Within the US, the GQL expert group has discussed the initial version of this paper, and we'll take a look at a revised version in January, but I expect a paper to be submitted for the March 2025 WG3 meeting. So we're looking at vectors and vector types. We've had discussions about cheapest path or optimal path. And I think the discussions within the US are coming to some sort of consensus, but we don't have a change proposal yet. But I wouldn't surprise me if that shows up at some point. There's been discussion today about schema information graph, and there's ongoing work in LDBC to specify a schema information graph. My hope is that that will result in a change proposal, but I don't know. I don't have any prediction of a time frame on that. Are there going to be other ideas? Possibly. I have a number of ideas myself that I'd like to convince somebody else to do the work on, but it really depends on participants to do the work. The challenges are that we want enough enhancements to justify a new version of the standard in a timely time frame. But at least the GQL vendors I've had discussions with about this, they don't want to be overwhelmed with new features. And in my experience in the years developing the SQL standard, there's benefits in being incremental in smaller increments rather than incremental in huge increments that take a long time. My current thinking is that we'll target 2027 for completing this, but it depends on a lot of things over which I have no control. So we have a new standard. It was new in 2024. The vendors are working on GQL implementations. I really would like vendors to document their implementation in conformance statements and make those conformance statements available to the public. We are working on GQL version 2, working on bug fixes that will go into a technical core agenda. We're working on new capabilities. In particular, I mentioned the conditional query execution and vector types. And I am hoping that we'll get a new version out in 2027. Any questions?